Welcome to the World Football Summit podcast, the show for football industry leaders who want to stay ahead of the game. We bring you the latest insights, trends, and stories from the experts driving innovation and progress in sports business worldwide. Join us as we dive deep into the ideas and initiatives transforming the world of football. From sustainability and innovation to player development, fan engagement, and everything in between. Our goal is to unite the global football industry and drive positive change and progress. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the World Football Summit podcast. I'm your host, Jaime, CMO at World Football Summit. And today, Alexander Bielefeld, Director, Global Policy and Strategic Relations at FIFPRO, is our guest on the show. I've been looking forward to having Alex on the show since he spoke at Football Innovation Forum in 2023. FIFPRO, as you probably know, is the global trade union, representing the voice of around 66,000 professional footballers and their national unions to ensure they are heard at the international level. Alex and I discuss a bunch of things, including the player workload situation and the risk that playing the current amount of games has for the player's health and even the business side of football. How that risk could grow further with new competitions, changes in formats of major tournaments, etc. Discuss some surprising findings from the Player Safety Report. And of course, we also discuss innovation and technology and how data can empower the player going forward. And so much more. Before we go into it though, don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast on your platform of choice and share it with your industry colleagues. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, where every week we send updates, trends, and everything that goes on at our events. You can find the link in the show notes. Remember, this 2024, we have events in London, Mexico, Sevilla. Check it out on our website, and we hope to meet you there. Now, nothing else from my side. I hope you enjoyed the episode with Alexander Bielefeld. Well, Alex, it's great to have you on the World Football Summit podcast. Ever since you spoke at the Football Innovation Forum in Turkey last year, I was looking forward to have you as a guest and glad to see we made it happen. So yeah, welcome.
Yeah. Hi, Jaime. Thanks for having me. Fantastic to be here.
So, Alex, before we touch upon the many topics that I want to cover with you today, I was wondering if you could briefly introduce yourself. And I always like to ask my guests why is it that you do what you do? Why a career related to football?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Alexander. I'm Director of Policy Strategy for men's football at FIFPRO, representing collective player interests on basically all the different workforce issues players face in the modern game today. And for me, I think the reason and the purpose which drive me in that job every day is probably a little bit my own background. I've been an academy player, never made it myself to be a professional player. I've seen my friends move on to the professional level. I've seen that how precarious such a career in professional sports can be. And then, of course, it's a massive privilege, I think, on the labor side and on a collective side to represent such a group of people and their concerns and, let's say, the dreams they have with regards to their profession. So for me, this is really it's a privilege to be in that position every day. Yeah, so far 6 years, and hopefully more to come.
Hopefully. And that's a great way to start, really, it's all about purpose. I like that. Um, Alex, let's get to it. I mean, everybody's talking about, concerns with the workload for players, the calendar. I was looking at the report you guys published last year. Let's put the audience into context. No, it was some data that I just found mind-boggling. Jude Bellingham, at his age, has played 4,000 more minutes than Wayne Rooney at the same age, 12,000 more minutes than Steven Gerrard, or 14,000 more minutes than David Beckham. Kylian Mbappe has played 37% more minutes than Henry. Vinicius has played 12,000 more minutes than Ronaldinho at the same age. I mean, what is going on? What's happening?
Yeah, it's crazy when you just look at these numbers and those statistics, right? And we have now been doing research on player workload in the calendar for over 4 years. And we have been publishing these annual reports, and we have so like every year innovated um, a little bit on how we crunch the data and how we look at player workload. And even for us as unions, I think it was quite a journey, I would say, in terms of really fully understanding player workload and performance and what that means from a player centric perspective, both in the men's game and in the women's game. So we have colleagues who do the same job we do on the men's side, on the women's side. And, I think for me, it's always staggering that actually, that the way we define and we understand player workload um, mainly centers around the amount of minutes or the amount of matches played. Um, Maybe also around, player availability, sporting injury. I think this is usually where also 2, 3 years down before where the understanding stopped. And what research has shown to us is that it's just much more complex when you really want to understand it from a holistic perspective of the player. Um, but you already showed those minutes, right? So you already showed the statistics. So there's something shifting in the industry with regards to how elite talent enters this industry and how much workload they're faced with. But that's just one part of the picture. I think the other side is what that means in terms of travel to accumulate so many matches, what that means on how much can you actually still train and try to become a better player
Mhm.
if the only thing you do is actually travel and play, right? What does it do to your career? What does it do to your ability to perform every match at your best ability, you know, as a player? What does it do probably to your time with your family and your friends because you're constantly on the road? What does it do to your mental readiness feeling there? So I think those are all aspects we've started to look into. And I think those are all the elements which are behind and lie under these numbers when you just look at them. But you're right. I mean, the amount of matches players play today are absolutely excessive without no safeguards, no rest periods. And we as player unions believe it has an extremely detrimental effect on the industry. I think these concerns are also shared by many leagues. I think many people who work in the industry, high performance coaches, you know, the coach is responsible for the entire squad as well. So unfortunately, we haven't seen the solutions yet, and unfortunately, we haven't seen the regulators to step in. Um, and I think this is what we're working towards. But I think everyone has come to understand nowadays that player workload is more than just the number of games. Um, and I think everyone understands that we have a massive problem there.
That's a good point. I mean, at the end of the day, sometimes we forget that players are people. You know, they have a life outside of football. And if you have them traveling around so much, I mean, they don't get to develop themselves in a career or even their personal relationships. Um, you know, um, Out of curiosity, who was the player with most minutes in 2022, 2023?
I think with Bruno Fernandes, who was quite high up there. Um, what you will usually see is that it fluctuates a little bit, right? Every year you have, a player based on the competitions and the performance of their club who probably will accumulate a few more matches than the other.
Hmm.
But what you can consecutively see across all these years is that the elite players, they all stay in the same rhythm, right?
Yeah.
So then there is a couple of, let's say, outliers because they go down, to the Champions League final or to a World Cup final that accumulates. And that's why they're leading the list. But you have a elite group of players who's actually much bigger than we thought at the beginning it would be, right? So that they're quite significant amount of players who are exposed to that, um, who are constantly above 55, 60 plus matches, right? And then someone like Bruno goes to 80. And we have the upcoming competition changes in the calendar, which makes it even worse. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well.
Hmm.
And and that makes it so hard. That makes it so hard. And the difference to some of the other sports is I think that, like someone like Bruno, If you would be an elite NBA player, you probably, I mean, you can't compare the sports just in terms of the load impact. It's very different, right? It's very different physical demand on the players. But if you just say, like, of course, it's an elite athlete, there will be a high workload. That's always the case, right? The question is not about is the workload high or should the workload be high or not. The question is really like what has an impact that is too negative on everyone, on the player, on the industry, on performance. And in the NBA, you have a 3-4 months off season period, right? Where the players can relax, where the players can work on new skills. And you don't have that in professional football. You have a calendar which is rolling over, competition to competition. And you have players who, with the amount of back-to-back matches and late night kickoffs, they can't train anymore. They
Yeah.
they, they only play and they don't even have a proper season break where they could relax. So I think those are really the main impacts behind these, let's say, 80 plus matches.
Yeah.
On like
Should be cause for concern when you see someone like Kylian Mbappe. Not too long ago, he was, he was saying that the calendar is cause of concern for them as players. And even in the NBA right now, they're having this controversy with Joel Embiid. He's getting injured, and if the load management and all of that. And what I'm struggling to see is why. I mean, it's obvious that the more games that players play, it's going to be a risk for the health. But if you think about it, it's probably going to be bad for business. And that's what I don't know why it's getting hard to see that, because if you get a player injured because he's playing too many matches, there's not going to be as much broadcasting deals. There's not going to be as much merchandise sales. Sponsorship is probably going to go down. So why do you believe clubs, leagues, etc., are having such a difficult time in seeing this, or they're not putting measures to control this?
Well, I think at the moment we're failing the game. We're not just failing, right, the players, as you said. I think there's a massive business and performance component to the conversational workload. Um, at the moment, I think everyone is just still a little bit short-sighted in the way that you want to have constant access to the best talent because you feel this is going to drive the game, and no one wants to give up on that talent. And I understand that because elite talent is rare, right? Like you know, this is just, what defines a absolutely outstanding world-class player, right? It means that, he's still a little bit better than all the other professionals who are already outstanding, right? But now you've seen with the example of Rafa Varane that we are risking this, these players remove themselves from the competitions, right? And it's very sad that we see that players have to remove themselves to protect their careers. And if you see the amount of minutes Jude Bellingham or Vinicius has played, you gotta ask yourself what's the impact on the career longevity, right? And how long is that player talent available to us as fans, as club, to actually perform at that peak, right? And constantly at the best level. And that's why we also absolutely support that narrative that there is not just a health impact and a human centric impact of too much workload, but there's a business narrative to that as well, which is quite fundamental for competitions. I think we have for too long closed our eyes, and I think also clubs and leagues and regulators have. And we know that this is not an easy conversation to have, right? Also with the players, it's not easy. The players want to play every, right? They're wired as competitive. They want to compete. Um, so for the players with that DNA to tell themselves or to come forward to actually say that we're playing too much, it's really hard. So
Yeah.
you're almost a step too far when you know that the players have to articulate that. But we found ways to regulate other things which are difficult in our industry, right? Like financial regulations, UEFA squad cost rules, league redistribution mechanism. All of that is not easy when you look at the technicalities of it. So of course, there's a way how you can tackle the workload question, how you also can tackle it in a fair manner about, how do you ensure a fair balance between the availability of players for the national teams, for club competitions internationally, and how do you also protect basically domestic competitions, which obviously also need to have access to this top talent in order to make domestic league competitions attractive, right?
Mhm.
Um, And I think no one wants to give up, and that's why everyone shies away from the question at the moment. But players don't tolerate it any longer. I think no one in the industry should tolerate that. Leagues shouldn't tolerate that. Clubs shouldn't tolerate that. And ultimately, FIFA or any regulator of competitions shouldn't tolerate that, because down the line, it is harming the integrity of our competition, and it harms also the business opportunities which we will have in the long term in our industry.
I understand the players obviously want to play, but I think them being competitors, they want to play to the best of their abilities. So, I guess that's why I'm having a hard time understanding why we're not letting players perform to the best of their abilities there, no? And that got me thinking, when you look at the NFL in the United States, they have really mastered the scarcity aspect of the game. And even in the business side of things, their earnings, and this is credit to Joe Pompliano and some research that he published, but their earnings are more revenues than the top five leagues in football combined. Um, so I was wondering, is this the model to follow?
Well, it tells you one thing, right? More matches doesn't necessarily, or more matches or more competitions doesn't necessarily equal more revenue. Sometimes to allow a product to be scarce has the same effect as just inflating the product, to a point where probably people getting saturated. I don't think personally that it's necessarily our job as player unions, right, to look into these very economic aspects of competition scheduling and competition modeling from a financial perspective. I think that that is a primary expertise or responsibility of the competition organizers. Um, but obviously, where this impacts employment opportunities and where this impacts the labor side of things, I strongly believe that players and unions should have a perspective on that. And uh, the NFL is also another interesting example to actually clearly regulate, right? When players, can train in preseason, when you can train as a team, what collective punishments or disciplinary measures are. When can you train full contact? When can't you train full contact, right? Also for health reasons. So there is a way on how you can, even though the perspective is probably a different one in every sport, but there is a way in how we as an industry in professional football can come together to address this problem. And we have so far not necessarily said that we can't play certain competitions, because it goes a little bit back to that argument I had before, right? This economic argument, I think, is predominantly something to be decided by those who bear also the financial consequences and risks involved in that. And that's clearly club management, club owners, you know, league front offices. They bear that responsibility, they bear that risk. So I think this is very much a conversation for them. So we didn't necessarily have a position, for example, in the Club World Cup. Don't play the Club World Cup, right? This never has been our approach. We understand why competition innovation has to happen or is happening, but, and that is the big but which we need to consider. We have said not every player is capable to play every competition you would like to put in the calendar. Specifically because we have different competition organizers who put different competitions in, but they all rely on the same talent, right? One day the same player should play Nations League, then the player should play the Copa, then the player should play the Club World Cup. You know, I think we had one player in the last report who played 10 different competitions in a season.
There you go.
Cup to club international competitions to that 10. Like, this is not possible if everyone wants to grow their competition and make it bigger. It just doesn't work anymore. So we don't want to tell you what you can or cannot organize, but we want us collectively to say, and we as unions will tell you what a player can or cannot play,
Mhm.
right? In terms of the total amount. And then let's have a discussion on how we distribute that availability of resource and talent to the different competitions. And that's, not an easy conversation, but it's a conversation you can have and where you can find solutions to. And this is where we are very clear. Like, we need to regulate workload. And if we regulate workload, the competition organizers who bear the risk on the economic development of the competitions, they shall do what they want, but not on the back and not on the burden of the players. I think this has come too far. We need to stop that.
Understood. And Alex, I know you're responsible for more the men's side of the game, right? But I need to ask you this because with the growth of women's football, there's also a lot of talk, with key players getting injured. And I'm wondering, do you see women's football learning from these? I don't want to call them mistakes, but these dynamics, let's say, that we see in the men's game, or is there cause for concern?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's fantastic to see the growth of women's football, right? It's fantastic to see how player pathways in the industry are are changing and have changed over the past years. I think it's quite clear to see that the player career today is very different than a player career in women's football probably was 10 years or 15 years ago, even 5 years ago. So but I think that's very positive to know. Um, at the same time, obviously, as the women's side of the industry is growing, there's the risk that you fall into some of the same traps men's football has fallen into, and at the same time, there's the opportunity to avoid that. And those things, I think they play out as we speak at the moment. I think there are probably some signs where you can clearly say, yeah, the women's industry, the women's game is learning and from the men's game and is avoiding certain pitfalls. But there are also certain risks which are still quite pertinent in the industry where we can see that, you know, maybe women's football nevertheless falls into some of these, flaws the men's game has not properly addressed. I think we're and my colleagues in women's football are quite clear on that, how we need to avoid that. Because as you say, like everyone is talking about ACL injuries in the women's game, right? Everyone is talking about player availability, not just because of ACL injuries, also of other, like barriers in the women's game. And even though we have, I think, seen a massive wave of new talent entering the women's game, the depth of talent is probably not as dense yet as in the men's game,
Hmm.
um, which has a lot to do with the conditions in the academies, right? The career pathways for young players, breaking into the professional game on the women's side of the industry. And missing out world class talent due to injuries, ACL injuries, and others in the women's game is just having probably on an aggregate level a impact that you can't compensate, you know, as a collective as easily as you probably could in the men's game because we just have a very dense group of talent in the men's game. So player availability is a massive concern, and I think a lot of people know that just from the injury side, and a lot of stakeholders have started to work on that, and um, we are now pushing our own sort of player-centric research project on ACL injuries and working conditions, and I think this is the key aspect. I think we need to avoid to fall into trap just to look at it from a medical perspective. This is something where sure you want to understand the injury side of this, but you need to understand the holistic player perspective on that. You need to be extremely player centric in how you approach this, and that's also why we feel as player unions that we have to bring that player centric perspective into that conversation while we're pushing our own projects on ACL injuries and the calendar at the moment. Um, Simply because in women's football, a lot has to do, with the conditions in the club environment, maybe also with the qualifications of the conditioning coaches, of the high performance coaches, um, even with their working conditions, the facilities. So we can't just look at it from a purely injury kind of like perspective. We need to take the entire ecosystem of the player into account for that. But yeah, I think this is a massive point to get right in women's football in order to allow it to grow.
Well, that's a good point. Being player centric, no, that's key. At the end of the day, the day they're the core of the game. But even if you look at it from the business side of things, if we're talking about that women's football needs to get access to new fans, to new markets, to grow, we need the best players available. If that's not happening, the game's not going to grow. So it seems obvious, but I was looking at the Money League report, and you see the increase in revenues. for the women's teams that they analyzed, it's 61% for one year over the other. If we want to continue that trend, again, we need the best players available. You alluded to competition changes, formats. So I was wondering, what is your assessment about, main changes we're going to see in the upcoming years? So, for example, the 2025 FIFA Club World Cup, or even the changes in the AFC's Cup. I don't know. What's your overall assessment about that?
I think it goes back to the discussion point we had before, right? I think it's incredibly important in the period we are that we continue to innovate competitions. And I think this is something where we as player unions and I think broadly the players, support the competition organizers, support um, FIFA, AFC, UEFA, domestic leagues to actually look into their performance and actually say, what can we do better? We have so many things which change in our society that, of course, this is impacting professional football. This is something where, from a commercial business side of things, we need to adapt. And I think there's a demand from fans and different audiences around the world, which also provide new opportunities for different actors in the market. And it's normal that they want to seize that. Um, and we as unions, I think we do not want to block that. I think what we want is that people are aware that all of these decisions they are making, even though it might just be a decision on a competition structure, or just adding one team or something to the competition, it changes probably down the line. The impact on the players is just more. I don't know, it's more nuanced. There's not just one single thing and one single factor which can be taken into account. So we want that those decisions that we know will have an impact on players, that we understand what that impact is, right? So that we go back to this argument of player centricity, that we realize that it's more than just one match which is added to the calendar or three matches, right? And that goes for the Club World Cup, it goes for the new format of the Champions League. Maybe every single one in itself is not a big change. Altogether is a massive change for the players. Um, Asia, I think, is you mentioned the competition reforms in Asia. We going don't want to talk too much about it because we're going to launch very very soon. I think next week our own research project on AFC competitions and I think holistic player perspectives on that. Asia comes with its own, challenges, specifically with regards to culture and distance and travel. So this is even more important from a player perspective in that region, specifically for international club competitions and national team competitions. But it's clear that the players in that region want more opportunities, right? And they want more sustainable opportunities. The important part is that they're sustainable, right? And they're sustainable from a player perspective, so not just commercially, but also really from a travel perspective, from a performance injury perspective. So those are things which need to be taken into account, and I think some of these aspects will be put forward also from those key unions in the market in Asia. So the unions in Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, Australia, who you know will have a quite detailed perspectives on what's good and probably what could be even done better.
Yeah. It's an important point that you mentioned there, no? That each competition is kind of like pulling towards its own, let's say, house. They're not really aligned, and that makes it challenging for the players. And I guess I'm wondering, and I know we're still far away from actually seeing it happen if it happens, but do you see a risk of something like the Super League being implemented for the players, or is it good for them? And I'm referring to both men and women because at the end of the day, there's going to be both if it goes through. So is it going to be the similar dynamic?
No, I think I think you need to look at that territory from territory to territory. I think, for example, I think the way you would look at the Super League project in Africa, for example, is probably very different than how you would look at that in Europe. And probably the perspectives from players in Africa would be very different, to the perspectives of players in Europe.
Mhm.
Now, in Europe, we had a perspective which is very, very clear. Players want to protect um, sporting merit, so they want to qualify for European international club competitions through sporting success in the domestic league. So that element of sporting merit is extremely important. Um, and they want the competition to be open and not to be closed as a consequence of that. And just based on that perspective from the players, I think the view of the unions, the view of the players is quite clear in Europe that they do not support a Super League project as it was presented. Um, the players love the Champions League. They love the identity of the competition. So from that perspective, there's absolutely no reason from a player perspective to change, and players do not want that. From a union perspective, I think there's also a very strong reason to protect domestic playing markets, just in terms of also of job opportunities for players to play in France, in smaller markets across Europe. So, so that perspective has been very strong. Now, again, what this means in Africa, is very different because the player experience in Africa is very different, right? Maybe they feel like that competitions domestically have not been developed so far, and they would benefit career-wise and employment-wise from a strengthened, more closed club competition at a Pan-African level. But again, I think this is something for the markets there really to analyze and to decide for themselves. But there is a regional specificity which is coming, which is added to those conversations. Now, personally down the line, I don't think that at the moment, anyone has an appetite, for a Super League competition. Not the fans, not the players. Um, the vast majority of clubs doesn't seem to be interested. Um, so that's that. Um, on the other hand, I'm also not. I'm I'm a pragmatic person in a in a sense that competitions have changed throughout history, right? I'm German. In the 1960s, the German Bundesliga was played in 4 divisions. And at some point, the clubs took the decision to actually merge it into 1 division. And that meant that for many clubs, they suddenly were not first division clubs anymore.
Yeah.
Um, but probably it allowed the competition to become denser, to become better, and to become what the Bundesliga is today.
Yeah.
So competition formats change. People decide that competition formats should be changed. So, if there's a majority of people wherever who think that should be changed, there might be reasons for that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I just don't see that. See at the moment in the fabric um, of the stakeholders, but also just of people individually. Everyone is quite happy with the competition formats as they are in Europe.
We'll have to see what happens. No? But I like the way you framed it, which is depending on the region, each player is going to have different needs. Again, goes back to the context of everything is just vital. No? Um, and one of the things that stands out to me actually is the way you guys focus on actually helping the players, being player centric, as you said before. No? And I think this is a good segue to talk about player IQ. So I don't know if you could help us understand what it is, um, what it covers, why is it needed,
Yeah.
anywhere you want to take it.
Yeah, thanks. Well, look, I mean, we simply felt that there was we're putting out a lot of research on the industry. Probably as we have discussed today, across all the different topics, sometimes this player-centric element, this player centricity, is missing. We sometimes, we publish financial reports from a club perspective or from a league perspective, and we publish competition reports and all sorts of things. But sometimes, we forget the player perspective, and we forget that the player perspective is more than just the absence of sporting injury or technical elements of the game. As you said before, the players are human beings first. So, what are the other needs the player actually has, and what are the needs which make up a player career, and what are the needs in a specific, let's say, context and employment context of our industry? I think today we probably cover as an organization, as FIFPRO, we cover 50 plus different policy areas. It goes from education, um, player development, um, medical issues, up to competitions, workload, or technology. So the field of issues we're covering is extremely broad. And in all of these fields, there's a perspective which is specific to the player. And a player will always have a slightly different outlook than, for example, a club. Um, and in many cases, the things will be aligned because they are mutually bound together. There's a common interest, right? There's a very strong common interest between the player and the club and the league, for example. But there are also within that nuances where the perspectives differ. And we felt that probably as unions, we hadn't done a very good job in articulating that nuanced perspective of the player. And we wanted to create something which simply frames all our research projects, all of the things we actually do from a player-centric perspective. So Player IQ is I think probably the only very player-centric knowledge hub in the football industry. And we're basically driving player-centric injury research. So be that on women's ACL injuries, to violence and abuse in the game, to player workload, um, and player IQ by now has different verticals. One of the verticals, for example, is also player IQ tech. So it's a very specific perspective on technology innovation in the game. Because again, I think this is something where in the past years it has had already such a big influence on our industry, on so many elements in our industry. And and this was also one area where we felt, wait, hold on a second. The perspective of the player is also quite positive towards technology innovation, but it certainly is different and probably more cautious than some other entities would look at that. And so we created Player IQ Tech to also build capacity in the union movement and amongst players and amongst the industry to understand what probably player perspectives could be when it comes to technology innovation in the game.
Thanks for that. I mean, the amount of data that you can gather from a player across a tournament or a game is just amazing. Right? You probably have some statistics that you can share with us, but I'm also wondering if you have some examples of things that players can actually do with their own data and how you're supporting them to, because there's one thing to gather, analyze data, but at the end of the day, they need time to understand it, to visualize it. So, maybe it's a loaded question, but again, what are some examples of the things that player could do with the data and how are you helping them understand that?
Yeah. Well, let's start with this with a short statistic. I don't know, like at the World Cup in Russia 5 years ago, 2018, we collected roughly 130,000 data points per player per match. So what do you think, Jaime, how much it was 4 years later in Qatar? Like a guess.
I'm getting, you could probably go at least into like what, 500, 600,000, more or less. I'm just guessing.
It was 8 million.
Wow.
Million data points per player per match.
Wow.
Uh, and the big switch was basically a switch in technology, right? So we went to what we call volumetric data capture. So it's optical cameras, which are under the stadium roof. We capture basically 29 limbs of the player to basically create a real-time 3D avatar of the player's movements. And we use that in Qatar actually for semi-automated offside, right? So if there's a offside decision, then you got also on television these recreations of the player silhouette, basically. And obviously, in order to be fully accurate, you need a lot of data, and that's actually what the technology has been used for. Um, but of course, that type of data, that level of data, is biomechanical movement data at the end of the day. You see the gap between old-fashioned tracking data of the 130,000 data points and the 8 million data points now, which probably in 4 years will be even more. That you might want to use those data points for other things. Maybe for injury prediction and for performance analytics and tactical analytics of the game. And I think there are many things where the player has an interest that this is happening as well, right? So the player will be quite supportive for that. But then obviously, specifically when it comes to injury prevention, I think there obviously is something which, from a player perspective, we call it a little bit the camouflage effect. because the first instance of the use of this data is always beneficial to the player. It's always positive. But then the second layer is probably a little bit more, let's say, risky, and the player wants to consider if he wants to do it or not. And that might be injury prediction because it can, of course, can have an impact on a contract. It might be the availability of these data points for scouting purposes, where the player wants to be at least aware. And I think normally every player would like to, probably say yes or no to that type of specific usage of these data points. Probably every player, is okay to use it for refereeing and match operation purposes, but everything that probably goes beyond this probably, should warrant a conversation between the player, collectively, individually, and the people who want to use the data. And we have seen that, this summer. I mean, we've seen that the same data is now being injected into the EA Sport SC game. That's
Nice.
data, right? And we're discussing at the moment, I think, at various levels, be it at league level or at confederation level, on what is required to actually use it for commercial purposes. And the biggest problem, I think, for the player when it comes to data technology is still that the player experience, both across the men's and the women's game, is that the player has no full access to their data, right? So we collect the data, but then the collector is kind of like just put it to one part, of the ecosystem of the industry. And we have actually troubles for players to being able to access the data. There's a massive problem for players to take the data from one entity or from one club to the next club, right? Or even to take their performance data at a very detailed level to their personal conditioning coach because they want to work with a conditioning coach outside of the club environment. So we have problems in our industry with fundamental basic rights the player has to their data, right? So very classical data rights, privacy rights. And I think everyone in the industry would benefit from creating a more holistic ecosystem between clubs, between leagues, um, in terms of the flow of data and how we basically agree collectively for what purposes data can be used or should be used. And the player, I think, is fundamental to that entire conversation. The player will benefit from that. And equally, I think if the player fully understands what is being done with the data, the player will be also supportive of the industry using this data, for research, for medical things, for match operations, as we said. So this is something I think where we have still a long way to go. I think it's also not so easy for players and for unions because now you do not only need to understand your own contract, you actually need to almost become a software engineer, right?
Yeah.
I don't know technology, but now you talk about algorithms and AI and doing and you know if you want to understand what your risks are, but also what your opportunities are, you need to understand what's behind it. And I think that's also a massive learning curve for the younger generations of players, and it just shows you how I think how a career in football today is so different than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah. It's much more complex.
Yes.
It's not simple, no? And speaking about risk, actually, I really enjoyed the um, player safety report that you guys published a few weeks back, I think it was. It goes back to being player centric. But I was wondering why was this report needed and what is considered within the realm of health and safety in professional football?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that one up. So I think like violence in football and different forms of violence, right? Everyone in our age group, I guess, like they just know it was always around, right? It's just part of the game and it's kind of like part of the culture and it's widely normalized or accepted. And sometimes you forget that probably it actually is not normal, right? And we feel that this is a topic which is, like when we talk about, for example, these 8 million data points, this is something which, you know, just at the moment affects, a few competitions who have the ability to use that type of technology from a resource and infrastructure perspective. So not every player will experience that. But obviously violence and abuse is something which, the player in the first division in Romania experiences and Mike Mignon and Serie A experiences it, right? Or Vinicius, or playing Premier League. So it's really something which I think connects our playing bodies. It really connects everyone in the game. Everyone can talk about that experience, and it's for us. It was so interesting. So we felt there was a after COVID there was even a increase, of violence in the game, pitch invasions, flares being thrown onto the pitch, um, attacks on team buses, you name it. And we felt there was an increase, but you know, it was a feeling. So we wanted to again put a more player centric perspective to that conversation and just bring a more evidence picture to the table to actually being able to discuss that. And the the research I think the research process was really interesting from a perspective that there's so much literature out there, on fan behavior, fan culture, crowd management from a policing perspective, and there's nothing on the player. Like there's almost, I think there was one article in a scientific journal on health and safety from a player perspective, and the problem is that it's really hard for researchers to get access to a player to open up to speak about these issues. And what I'm finding, in the report was that players and unions say, well, we don't want to talk about this issue because it has repercussions on my contract, it has repercussions on my relationship with fans, with my club, my future employment opportunities. So it's not a surprise that players don't open up to researchers. And therefore, the entire perspective of the player on this issue is almost missing in the nuance. So what we have done as a consequence, we got together with players from our global player council and we started to talk with players, in a safe space about these issues. And a lot of the players, every player is cherishing the positive relationship between the player and the fan. It is something very unique in our industry. It's very different than in basketball or in other professional sports. So they are they're very aware of that and they cherish that. And they know that the vast majority of fans is probably very respected. But there is somehow a very influential, very significant smaller group of people who create a absolutely unsafe environment for many players. And the way players have opened up in these interviews to us, and some quotes from players are in the report, you will never hear players talk about that side of the game that bluntly and that honestly and genuinely in any media interview because they're
Yeah.
not afraid.
Yeah.
But it shows you what it actually does, right? And then you have the rare occasion where someone like Mike Mignon walks off the pitch and just says, look, guys, lot, that's too much. And we just had the situation in Cyprus, like it's these occasions where it's not an international media spotlight. Like just Cyprus at the beginning of January, I think two incidents, one player being impacted because hit, I think, with a glass bottle or something like that. And a week later, a flare and something exploded and, hearing problems and the players went on strike. And and now you have massive conversations in Cyprus about how to deal with the issue. In Greece, I think already this season's fans are locked out collectively out of the stadium because government didn't know how to deal with it. And that's also not a great situation because, of course, players want fans to be in the stadium. They want to avoid collective punishment. So the question is really, what can we do about it? How can we identify perpetrators? How can we initiate effective football banning orders, right? Where it's necessary. Where can we have better dialogue between fans and players? I think this is also part of the solution, of course. But I think the level of violence and normalization of behavior we would not tolerate anywhere else in our part in our society. Not, and I'm not talking even about work, right? The workplace. The level of tolerance we show in football is very disrespectful actually to the players.
Agreed. And just to give the audience some context here, let's just share some data that was coming out of the report, which to me was very surprising. And I actually shared this on an episode of the podcast a few weeks ago now. And 90% of players suffer discriminatory verbal abuse. Um, One would wonder, why is this seen as normal? But I guess more importantly is that 83% of them agree that this could actually cause mental health issues, depression, and so on. Um, this is just a
huge cause for concern. If you're a fan, you should be, you know, wouldn't you want your players to be at the top of their game? I mean, I don't know. Or even, and this is not only something that you see in men's football, you also see it in women's football. I think it was 30+% of the union said that they were seeing increasing violence in women's football as well. So, I mean, these for me were very surprising facts. I don't know if there's something else that stood out to you once you went into the research and obtained the insights.
Well, I mean, I think the women's football aspect is interesting because we started to integrate that into the research methodology. Then at the end, I think we felt it was not, we didn't have enough really sound evidence on understanding the landscape of women's football. Maybe it was also a bit early, so we didn't integrate it fully into a final report. And we left it at something where probably there's more research needed in the future on the women's football side to be really specific, do justice to the women's game. But it was quite clear that unions can see that there are emerging signs that with the transitioning of male football fans into the women's game, and I think this is something everyone's working actively towards too, right? So how can we generate more interest from the fan groups we already have to probably also get an interest, in women's football, specifically within the teams they follow. And that creates, on the one hand, a better atmosphere in the stadiums, but it also changes the time. It also changes the atmosphere of the game. And that has positives to it and has factors to it. So yeah, of course, like one of the concerns could be, that you import the same levels of abuse and violence from the men's game probably into the women's game, where at the moment this type of violence and this type of abuse is not an issue, right? There are very specific issues with regard to the sexual violence in women's football, but let's say the setup of violence and abuse we see in men's football, we don't see it yet in women's football. But as you said, that there are probably early warning signs that there's some sort of a migration happening, which you would like to stop early on. Um, no, I mean, look, I think the topic of violence it's an abuse. Like we implemented with FIFA at the men's World Cup and then the women's World Cup the social media protection service, which was a dedicated service to actually filter abusive messages on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, towards the players. And yeah, it's just another element, where I think you see how abhorrent the abuse is. And my brother, he's a player agent, and just last weekend he had a young academy player, I will not say the club, who played already in the first team, who had a match for the second team, scored against another team. I think there were still probably 15,000 fans in the stadium, and in a away match, and the amount of abuse he got from the other team, from the fans of the other team, on his Instagram account, just because he scored a goal, and has a different skin color than the one of mine, as you can see quite well. Um, was ridiculous. What was just abhorrent, and what that does to a 17-year-old kid is
Yeah,
crazy.
it impacts them for life, no? And I'm wondering, just to finish this section off, Alex, is there any league competition, doesn't even have to be football, that is tackling this issue well?
Of course, I think we have leagues, we have competitions where we, where a lot of things are already done. Um, I just think from a player perspective, not quite enough, because the topic is so systematic that it affects the player. I feel it undermines also the integrity of our industry and our sport. And if people think this is culturally still great, and this has something to do, of course, it's not just a football problem; it's a society problem. But we do have a very specific, I think, responsibility towards what happens in our stadiums. And we can do all together, we can do better job to make the stadiums a safer place for everyone, for coaches, for fans, for families, for the players, for spectators and audiences on television. We can do that. But, I think there needs to be a will, and people need to also be willing to sometimes make decisions which are not popular with certain parts, of our of our industry. But I can clearly say that with a lot of confidence, after we have done now the research, after we have talked to players, after we have surveyed all the unions, that this is a massive problem in our industry, which probably so far didn't receive the urgency in terms of the attention we have given to it that we probably should have.
Yeah, and which is why I was very, I mean, quote unquote, happy to see this published, because we need to give visibility to see to these issues, and then we need the entire ecosystem to kind of bring itself together and think of solutions from every single angle. No, um, Alex, I mean, this has been such a great conversation, and I want to be respectful of your time. If you let me, I just want to ask you two rapid fire questions. Um, in the past, we've also talked about how football impacts culture. Um, Even culture impacts football. So is there anything that either concerns you, or the other way around? Is there that something that you celebrate around the relationship between football and culture?
Well, look, I think there is. I mean, the other day I had a fantastic book in my hands. It was about football and fashion,
Mm-hmm.
so clearly culture. And you know, I mean, obviously, in every generation of players, you get this conversation on the new generation is different, and they're not respectful, and they don't know how to handle the money, or they're not respectful to the game or to the values, and and I understand. I think it's probably a very normal reaction, from someone who's older, and I myself getting older, so I'm probably have the same reactions, probably towards my kids at some point. Um, I remember when I was a young player, it was this kind of like people started to wear colored boots, like white, like boots and like red boots, and the older generation of players was just like they thought we were all nuts. They thought we were crazy, and we felt it in every in every training. We could feel it, you know. And but then I looked at this book I mentioned. They were all just kids and players of their generation in their time, and I saw already pictures of Günter Netzer, Paul Breitner, in the
Yeah.
fur coats, like you know, hanging out in his cabriolets and like convertible cars and everything. And it wasn't different. Like if you would have given those players at that time TikTok or whatever, they would have been very different.
Yeah.
They were kind of the same thing. But it's interesting if you compare that, because in the book you can really see how things changed and how fashion changed and how players embraced it. And yeah, it was just it was the same principles throughout. It didn't matter if you had a young Pogba or a young Paul Breitner. It was just happening in a different context.
Mm-hmm.
And now I saw an interview with the German second league player who's playing for Hertha BSC Berlin, who's coloring his fingernails, and he said
Yeah.
probably would have been impossible for the ultra groups of Hertha BSC Berlin to embrace him as a player 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
He's captain of the team, and he's kind of like a symbol to the club in Berlin, and it's just part of the culture, and it's acceptable, and it's the young generation of players who bring this into the game, um, and it's fantastic to see, and it's great to see, because I think the game is changing, and it just shows you how it's connected. And football will always be connected to the young generations in our society, because it's the players on the pitch who will represent the game ultimately, and they will be kids of their generation.
Mm-hmm.
We can see that changing. So that's actually for me is that's a good connecting element, which is again I think quite driven by the players at the end.
You're gonna have to send me the name of that book, not only because I want to read it, but there's also someone on my team that I'm pretty sure he's gonna enjoy it. So any recommendations that you can throw our way, it's gonna be fantastic. Alex, we've discussed a lot today, and I think you're one of the persons that or people, sorry, that I need to ask this question. As you know, last year at World Football Summit, we launched a rebrand. Um, you know, the, we're really looking forward to having a an industry that commits to being more professional, that embraces innovation, sustainability. And we summarized that around the claim that said the football we want and the football we need. No. So if I were to ask you to describe very briefly in 1, 2 sentences the football you want or the football you need, how would you do it?
Well, look, I would give the power to those people who, who are affected by that. So, I'm a union man. So I would give that into the hands of the social partners, right? So, on the one hand side, players on the labor side is a social partner. On the other one, the employers, the clubs, the leagues as an employer association, and let them negotiate what they feel comfortable with.
Mhm.
Equally, if those social partners negotiate with the fans, I think the compromise at the end will always be good. I think the the football we don't need is where someone just dictates what it is, right? Without fully understanding or ignoring the impact it has on the people who are actually affected by that.
Mhm.
Mm. I feel we're in an industry which has enough quality in amongst its people to actually give that responsibility to the people who are affected to make these decisions together.
Mhm.
And in many parts of our industry, we do it, and in others we don't, and we just see that this always leads to conflict and clashes, which I think ultimately are bad for the game and bad for for everyone involved.
Thanks for Alex. And thank you for this conversation in general. I think I've had so much fun. I would keep you here for hours just talking about these issues. Um, but is there, any last words that you have for the audience, or where can listeners find more about FIFPRO, about you, about all the reports that you guys are publishing? The floor is yours.
No, I don't. Thanks so much for having me. Uh, it was really a pleasure. I think we can all talk about these issues for hours, specifically also about the cultural aspects in the game.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Um, and well, look, I mean, I think FIFPro and Player IQ, we've committed to the partnership with World Football Summit. We're very proud of that. We love the conversations we can have, either online or in person at your events. And I know the next ones are around the corner and they're coming up. And, the team at FIFPro, myself and everyone else, is always available, as well the unions. So just reach out, and we're really looking forward to continue all of these conversations, in different forms. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And these conversations are much needed. So we're happy to see you guys joining us around the world in all these events. Thank you, Alex. Have a good day.
Bye.
And there you have him, Alexander Bielefeld from FIFPro. This was such a fun conversation for me because at the end of the day, it's just analyzing the issues that impact what is the true essence of the game, which are the players. No, so let me run through my notes, see if I can summarize everything for you very briefly. At the end of the day, you know, um, we need to make sure that we understand that players are human and that there's so many things impacting their lives beyond just playing matches. No, but even if you look at it from the business side of things, you have to understand that playing more games is not necessarily going to drive more revenues. Just look at the NFL and really understand the value of scarcity. Um, this is something that we'll be discussing in upcoming episodes as well with other guests on the show. And this is impacting both the men's and the women's game. No, it is true that each competition is different, and each region is different. But what we need is alignment to really take care of the players. So each competition or event organizer has to understand that without the players, there's really nothing to do. No, um, for that, technology is key, and I was just amazed with the data points stat that Alex shared with us. So now 8 million data points per player per match are being analyzed. That's just, it's mind boggling. Um, but we really need to help players understand what they can do with this data. Um, and from the playing side, but also from the business side. At the end of the day, it's going to benefit their careers. But if they don't understand it,
they're not going to be able to be brave enough to accept others accessing their data. No, so really have to help them understand. No, and finally, I was really pleasantly surprised with what Alex was mentioning at the end on the connection between football and culture through fashion. It is something that we've discussed, in some articles on our blog, and it's true. Football impacts culture, but culture also impacts football. No. So anyway, those were the main takeaways from me, and I want to understand if anything else stood out to you. If so, make sure you reach out on social media, and before you go, don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast on your platform of choice, and share with your industry colleagues. It helps us a lot. And I want to thank you for tuning into this episode of the World Football Summit podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure I did. Nothing else from my side. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you next time.